You're listening to Theology and Apologetics with Thomas Fretwell, bringing theology to life.
So we're going through our Heroes of the Faith series. You may remember we were doing John Wesley. We did John Wesley in two parts. And if you remember, at the end of the second part, studying the life of John Wesley, the leader who was one of the people that started the evangelical revival that, as many say, saved England and ultimately spread across the world, we saw that his last letter, John Wesley wrote a lot of letters, he wrote a lot of journals, we went through that, but the last letter he ever wrote was to a young politician named William Wilberforce. You can see that's William Wilberforce there. This was February the 22nd, 1791. I'll just read the final line. He said, "Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, that vilest that the sun ever saw, shall vanish away before it." And Wesley died 6 days after he wrote that letter, and it's an interesting way he phrases it, be not weary of well-doing. And there is probably no greater word of encouragement that someone like the life of William Wilberforce proves. He needed that being sent to him. So we're going to take a look at the man that Wesley wrote this letter to. His name is William Wilberforce, and he also is a man that literally changed the world. Yet he is a man who is largely unknown by many today. You may be taught about him in your school history lessons. I remember just last year reading Jake's, whatever year he is at Clavering, that kind of age, 14, his history, where they teach a little bit about this and about the abolition of slavery, and they talked about William Wilberforce. However, as you could probably imagine, they absolutely, completely miss everything to do with why he did what he did, and thus they ruin the whole story. Of course, hopefully we can give you a bit of understanding of that tonight. William Wilberforce was born in Hull in 1759. He was the only son of a very wealthy merchant. If you go to Hull today, they have a whole Wilberforce museum and a statue of him there. He's one of these guys that you'll see statues of him in all these old sort of buildings, portraits of him in weird pubs in Cambridge and like in Westminster Abbey and all places like this. You'll see statues of Wilberforce testifying really to the impact that he did have on the nation. Wilberforce was 10 years old when his father died. He was then sent. His mother, who couldn't really cope at that time, sent him to live with his aunt and uncle. Little did she know that the aunt and uncle were great friends of Mr. George Whitefield and followers of Mr. Wesley. So that's linking back to the last studies that we did there. They were very much part of the nonconformist evangelical movement that was started by those two in the Great Awakening. And during that time that Wilberforce was with his aunt and uncle, they had a friend of theirs quite often would come and preach, and that man was a man named John Newton, if you know that name. He pops up again later, John Newton of course, Amazing Grace fame. He would come and preach in the home of this aunt and uncle of William Wilberforce. So he became acquainted with him at a very early age, but then not much happened for a long time in his life. Now his mother, Wilberforce's mother, was more of a traditional Anglican. Now, you remember I explained to you tension between the traditional Anglicans and the nonconformists at that time. So the way they thought it was the Anglicans were the true, the orthodox, the originals. The nonconformists were these crazy radicals who were just doing things however they wanted, didn't care for traditions, and they didn't really get on too well. So the mother, getting wind that they'd sent William to a nonconformist household, got a little scared and didn't want him becoming a Methodist, so pulled him back and took him out of that influence. At 17, Wilberforce went to Cambridge University, and he became, as they say, financially independent the following year. And one of his relatives dies, and he inherited a lot of money. He was a very, very wealthy person at this time, so wealthy that in that day and age, if he didn't want to, he never would have needed to work in his life. And because of that, he had a rather nice time at university. You may remember, even those of you who have been there with good, big student loans, you don't, and assuming you're not a Christian in those days, it's just probably describing my own life to you, it doesn't help you live a very straight and narrow life at university. You enjoy the social scene. William Wilberforce was extremely immersed into the social life of university at this time. He was extremely popular. He was well known for his wit, for his conversation, and also for his generosity. He made many, many friends at this time. He was known as the life and soul of the party, always out and about anywhere, or anyone was having a do, he would be there. One of the friends he made at Cambridge was a man named William Pitt. You may be familiar with that name. William Pitt at this stage, he would be a future Prime Minister of England. And it was, in fact, William Pitt and his friendship with William Pitt that actually got him interested in politics. And in the end, they used to often go and just watch things in the House of Parliament together. And he was the one that persuaded Wilberforce to get into politics. So he decided to run for an MP in Hull in 1780 while he was still a student at university, aged just 21. And because of his skill in speaking, winning over the crowds, being very good at what he did, he won by a pretty large majority. So in 1784, his friend William Pitt then became the Prime Minister, which, as you can imagine, you're very wealthy, you're very well respected, you go to Cambridge, and now your best friend's just become the Prime Minister. You've got quite a lot of doors open to you there. And Wilberforce then decided to run for a bigger constituency, the seat of Yorkshire. This was one of the largest and most coveted seats in the House of Parliament, in the House at that time. And you can see he had a lot of opposition for that, as you would expect. He was still a very young minister, very inexperienced, but he was a brilliant, brilliant speaker, very persuasive, and he won. And he became the MP for Yorkshire. And he was to remain an MP for Yorkshire and various different constituencies for the next 45 years. Now, his skill at speaking and his wit in doing it made him extremely popular. However, in his early days as both an MP for Hull and Yorkshire, he had no real passion in life. So he wasn't like campaigning for any specific issue in Parliament. He was known for sort of jumping on this bandwagon, that bandwagon, and not really caring too much either way, because he didn't need to. He didn't need a job. It was just, he was learning the trade, but he had no real passion at that point. But all that was about to change. In 1784, running over into 1785, he travelled across Europe with his sister. They were seeking some help with her health. And sister and mother, he went over to Europe. They also invited with them a man named Isaac Milner, who was a former tutor of William when he was young, and he was also a family friend. And again, little did they really understand at this point, but Milner himself had become a nonconformist evangelical too. However, Milner was also one of these extremely intelligent academics, tutor at Queen's College, Cambridge, a mathematics professor, and he was also a really, really staunch evangelical Christian. So William again got to travel around in that sort of company for these 2 years. And during these times in carriages and travelling across Europe, he presented to Wilberforce what it really meant to have a robust, serious thinking Christianity. And the term serious Christianity was a term that Wilberforce would often use. He would later write a book comparing what he called serious Christianity with the dead religion of cultural Christianity, of what he was used to growing up in that age. And that's kind of always what spurred him on to make sure that he was serious about his Christianity. He did not have any time for this cultural religion. And if you remember our Wesley studies, you'll understand why he thinks that, because of all those things that the Anglican Church did, all those laws that they made, and all of the people that the Church put in place. Over the next months, anyway, him, Wilberforce, and his friend, this tutor, they picked up a copy of Philip Doddridge's book, The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. It's one of those books, we've probably never heard of it, but it was a life-changing book for so many people during this era. It was one of these nonconformist ministers, Philip Doddridge, just translated and copied and copied and copied, brought so many people to the Lord. But these two would study this book together. And with Milner's careful guidance, Wilberforce came, as he said, to a settled conviction on the truth of Christianity, and he came under a deep conviction of sin through the Spirit, and he committed his life to Christ. And he wrote to Pitt, his friend William Pitt, the Prime Minister, telling him what had happened. And he referred to it ever since as the great change in his life. That time was the great change, that year, travelling with that man. And he was warning him that from this day forward, his conscience would be captive not to a political party, but to Christ. And I feel like, because William Pitt was not a believer, he was conservative and those sorts of things, and he had good, he helped Wilberforce, as we'll see, in some of his work, but he wasn't a believer. So I'd imagine he wanted Wilberforce to just sort of be on his side, and he was maybe using him a little bit like that. But here, the first thing Wilberforce does is write to Pitt and tells him he's not captive to any politics, but he is captive to Christ. And that just shows you like the immediate change in heart of a conversion that we see here in this man's life. And however, it's interesting, although you might think, yes, finally, this is the start of the story, this actually threw him into a spiral at this point, a turmoil in life, a crossroads as he describes it. And that really was this. His life was very much high-end MPs, parties, like St James's, the Carlton Club down in St James, London, these exclusive Conservative club members, things like that. High-end stuff, that was his life. MPs, politicians, and obviously now he's a believer, and it was pretty frowned upon for believers to be that involved in politics at this time. So what do you do? Should you continue in Parliament, or the other option was you pursue ministry? You go into the priesthood or the clergy, and you pursue some sort of work with the church. And this was a good thought. We actually discussed this a few weeks ago in our men's group. Someone raised a question about feeling like at work they're just wasting their time, or feeling like just in their secular job that they can't do ministry, as they called it. And we sort of talked about that and tried to identify that's a false dichotomy that we create between secular work and ministry. William Wilberforce's life is an absolute testimony to that fact, and he very much, for him to walk out of politics at this time would have been absolutely catastrophic. The world may be completely different to how we know it today if Wilberforce had obeyed the voice of all the ministers and Christian people in his life who were telling him to go into ministry now. And he was in this turmoil. He did love politics, and that was his thing. However, he couldn't make this decision on his own. He was a young believer for all intensive purposes, so he did a wise thing and he sought counsel. And this is something we often forget to do, isn't it, in the Christian church? We should always be seeking and have an ear open to the counsel and opinions of others. Now, who do you think he sought out for counsel at this time? That old friend, that old man he used to listen to as a boy living with his aunt and uncle that he knew was in London, a man, the evangelical John Newton. And it's been said that 240 years ago, one of the most important conversations in British history took place, one that would subsequently impact the entire world. And it happened at this church. Now, you remember, some of you may have been on our walking tour of London, where we did a Bible tour of London. They'll take you into this church. This is John Newton's church in London, and you can see there the pulpit on the side. When we went in there, he let us all stand in the pulpit and read the Bible. But this is where that meeting took place, and it was a clandestine meeting. Newton was an out, nonconformist evangelical. He was not respected by the political establishment. For a politician to be seen meeting with him could have ruined his political career. So he wrote him this letter and said, look, I've got all these things I need to talk to you about. You need to swear secrecy that you won't tell anyone that I'm coming to you. And he did, and eventually they had this meeting. And it's funny when you think, this meeting in that church between two evangelical Christians, one of them, a former slave trader turned pastor, the other, a man about town politician turned evangelical, new evangelical. And in that church and in that room, that conversation between two people, the world was changed as we know it in many ways, and we'll get to that. And I think it's a fact worth mentioning, as if you've ever done any study on all of the social reforms, particularly the abolitionist movement, through history, through academia, through historians, this is always the part that gets left out, the part that no one really wants to talk about. The motivation and the reason for the abolitionist movement was entirely Christian. It was completely evangelical. And all it took was two people in a church submitted to the Lord for him to do away with one of those, this evil that we're going to see was plaguing the world at this time. It's an amazing story. You may remember 2007, I believe, a movie came out called Amazing Grace. That was like a biography of Wilberforce, but they named it, of course, after Newton because of this conversation there. Newton encouraged him to stay in Parliament, and a year later he would follow this up with a letter where he wrote these words. So this is Newton writing to Wilberforce. He said, "God has raised you up for the good of the church and the good of the nation. Maintain your friendship with Pitt. Continue in Parliament. Who knows that but for such a time as this, God has brought you into public life and has a purpose for you." Very, very sound advice that Newton gave him there. He could have easily said, no, we need you in the church, we need preachers, come into the church. But he had the foresight, probably because of his background and his history, that he knew Wilberforce had a very direct calling on his life. In 1786 now, news of Wilberforce's evangelical conversion spread, and this brought out other evangelicals out of the woodwork who saw him as a leading politician, one of the largest constituencies, and they started obviously wanting him to get involved in the abolitionist movement. There were a few other people at this time who were doing it. John Wesley was one of the ones previously who had started these movements. And he was approached by a group of friends. These were wealthy businessmen, these were other MPs, they were politicians, they were all people that were using their influence for social reform. And they were all evangelicals and they were all motivated by their Christian faith. Some of their names, Thomas Clarkson, he's a very important abolitionist figure. Josiah Wedgwood, yeah, you may remember him. I'll come back to him a little bit later. Lady Middleton, Charles Simeon, Granville Sharp, Hannah More. These were all were once very famous names in England. This group became known as the Clapham sect. Have you heard that term before? The Clapham sect. There's a Clapham in the place in London. They all lived around this area. There wasn't many of them, 12, maybe up to 20 sometimes, up and forth, down. But the things that they did in London, like the transformations that they made across England and the world, is quite remarkable. They are responsible for many of the social reforms that people like Wesley started. These were the ones that actually brought them over the finish line and made them into law in many ways. You can see the Clapham sect there, just like that. And they were all in it together. There's many biographies that have been done about all these different people, but one thing you'll learn, and this is again another good lesson for us today, because we tell the story, don't we, about Wilberforce. But Wilberforce will be the first to admit, and he says it many times, it wasn't just Wilberforce. He had a whole group of brothers and sisters behind him, and they were prayer warriors for him. The way he describes it, they were like Joshua and Aaron holding up the arms of Moses when he prayed so that Amalek was defeated. And this is what they did. They were knit together through Christ, through shared purpose, through unity of spirit, and through laboring side by side against a hostile world. He confirmed all of these things in his writings. And Wilberforce, with this group of friends behind him praying, and after much seeking the Lord, he came to the conclusion that he had a definite calling on his life. In 1787, he wrote in his diary, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." It's a funny phrase, that. Reformation of manners means he's referring to many of the other social ills, particularly vice and those things that, if you remember from our previous studies, were pretty common in London at that time. Now, for the next 2 years, with his friend Thomas Clarkson, they researched and they gathered all the evidence they could about the real horrors of the slave trade. So they went over to the West Indies, they went to Africa, they documented as many things, they did interviews. They were absolutely meticulous in the work that they did, and it was absolutely necessary that they did all of that. They made themselves master of the facts about things like the so-called Middle Passage, which was that journey from Africa to the West Indies, the most dangerous part of the journey. That famous diagram of the slave ship that if you've ever looked in a history textbook, you'll always see that diagram. It's always put in history textbooks, and so it should be. But what they never tell you is that that was produced by two evangelical Christians. It was produced as evidence to present to the House of Commons in their abolition bills to try and get slavery abolished. And they were the two that were responsible for doing that. No one else was interested in doing this at the time. You think of it, this wasn't just a transatlantic slave trade. Slavery has been on the earth. You had the Barbary slave trade before that. You had the Viking slave trade, the Irish slave trade. It's been really, from time immemorial, this has been a problem. You read about it in the Old Testament. But never before has there been a national movement to wipe it out, except this one started by these two evangelical Christians. In all the history of the world, it's unheard of and unusual, and that, again, is testimony because they were motivated by the words and teaching of Jesus Christ at this time. The slave trade at this time, 1700s roughly, thousands of slaves, hundreds of ships, millions of pounds, entire economies, Britain, France, much of Europe, dependent on it. In 1788, he first introduced his bill to abolish slavery. He had his mission, he had his calling, he'd done the work, and now he was putting that faith into action, and he had that first bill read in the House. And let's just say it went down like a ton of bricks. It was a very cool hearing. He was undeterred. That's kind of what he was expecting the first time, because this was such a radical proposal in those days. He reintroduced it into Parliament the next year, and he continually got rebuffed and derided. Year after year, he did this. Again and again and again. He faced apathy, scorn, ridicule. He was vilified. He was known at one stage, after he continually kept doing this, as the most hated man in England, is what the papers were calling him, again trying to discredit him for what he was doing. But he didn't give up. He knew what was right. He had his biblical convictions for this, and he had this calling from the Lord. And in spite of all of these failures, he persevered. And I like this. When you think of that first line of encouragement that John Wesley wrote to him, do not weary in doing good. And this is a real thing. This is the entire life of this man, William Wilberforce. He continually, failure did not put him off. He continued, and he continued. In 1789, he gave a 3-hour speech to Parliament detailing the horrors of the slave trade. And he ended his speech like this. He said, "As soon as ever I had arrived thus far in my investigation of the slave trade, I confess to you, sir, so enormous, so dreadful, so irredeemable did its wickedness appear, that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. A trade founded in iniquity and carried on as this was must be abolished. Let the policy be what it might, let the consequences be what they would, I from this time determined that I would never rest till I had effected its abolition." And then he stopped and he looked out. And you can imagine the shock. You can imagine some of the enemies he had in that room at this time now because of this stance. And he said, "Having heard all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." And although the bill didn't get through this time, that was a turning point, because people's hearts were starting to be opened and awakened, and the message was starting to get out. It was a very powerful speech. However, the opposition, as they call it, the slavery lobby at this time, were equally powerful. They had a lot of money, and they again ramped up their campaign against him. He came back the following year, 2 years later, in 1791. He had more facts, more evidence, more eyewitness testimony. They used to go round and collect evidence from slaves, former slaves, and present them to people. And again, most of their work, it's because of their work that we have all of this evidence and documentation, so it's very important. Again, it was rejected. From 1793 to 1797, every year again, he presented the same bill, annually presenting this bill for abolition in Parliament. Annually, it was rejected. So you would think at this time that he'd be getting fairly discouraged, wouldn't you? I mean, and actually he was starting to get discouraged. His colleagues in Parliament would refuse to listen to his words. He would do all that he could. Sometimes he'd bring chains with him and he'd have them on his shoulder when he was speaking in Parliament. He'd have people with him who were testifying to things. He did everything he could. And because of this, it personally meant he endured many attacks in the newspaper. His character was assassinated, he was physically assaulted, he faced death threats, and he had to travel with armed guards whenever he was outside of Parliament himself. But the abolitionists, again, it wasn't just Wilberforce, remember, he had a whole praying team of evangelicals behind him, and they were pretty resourceful too in some ways. They were very good at public relations, and they devised radical new ways of bringing their cause to public attention. Most of these are things we just all take for granted were done, making pamphlets and giving them out. We call these things tracts today. This is where this came from. He is actually one of the founders of the Bible and Tract Foundation in England. It's one of his other things that he did at the same time as all of this. They would get these pamphlets full of eyewitness testimony, and they would circulate them, and they were extremely graphic. And that was because one of the ways that this trade was allowed to continue is because everyone closed their eyes. No one was really looking for to understand the full depth of the depravity involved with it. So what their method was to take what they were finding and put it in all its graphic detail right in front of these people so that they could not ignore it any longer. It was a very bold but very necessary tactic. This is exactly where pro-life groups today got their tactics from. If you read many of the big pro-life groups, these banners that you see in towns when they're showing abortions and things like that, they know they're extremely graphic. It's exactly the same kind of thing because people they've never even seen some of this stuff. They don't really understand what is happening, and they have said we got this from the abolitionists, from those early evangelicals. It was their approach that was so successful. Remember the potter Josiah Wedgwood that I mentioned earlier, one of these Clapham sect. You may know that name if you look for things like this. How many of you have a Wedgwood plate in your house? Have any of you got a Wedgwood plate? They were very popular in this country. He was a pottery maker. You'll see probably thousands of them in antique shops and places like that around now. But he was also a staunch evangelical. At that time, he joined, and they, again, one of their tactics to get this cause to the public was he designed a famous symbol. It was an enslaved man on a bended knee. And at the bottom of the brooch was the inscription, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And this became a rallying call for the abolitionists. They would use this and they would have these pins on their jackets, and they would slowly start to there'd be more and more of them in Parliament. There'd be more and more of them around London, as it was like just a rising movement, all being motivated by this little group of evangelical Christians, of course, praying and doing what they were doing, having all of this impact. They held public meetings, they wrote songs, they composed poems, they did petitions, they even organised boycotts of plantation sugar and things like that. All these tactics that they used to try and defeat this massive, powerful lobby that was bringing all of this opposition to the bills that were trying to get through Parliament. And you can imagine how frustrating and how this must have been for these people. Of course, they're kind of like the underdogs, obviously, in some respects. But again, with the Lord, you're never an underdog. All you need really is faith in the Lord. In 1796, the abolitionists thought they had sufficient support in Parliament to succeed at last. And this is because many more, again, this was also the time the evangelical awakening was still spreading at this time too. So many more MPs were becoming evangelical Christians, which of course predisposed them to joining the abolitionist movement at this time. So slowly the tables were turning. And it got to the point where they thought, no, we've got the numbers now, we can have a vote. And this is how sort of cunning and conniving the opposition were. They knew that they didn't have the numbers and they could lose this. So what they did is they learned that one of the most famous Italian operas was playing in London, like a massive event. So they purchased a whole load of tickets for this, and they distributed them for free in the House that day. And this was on the same night that the House were voting on this issue. And they distributed these tickets for free across the House, knowing that they were getting into the hands of the right people, who were the swing people and people who weren't necessarily could go either way. And that's what they did. And that's basically what happened. A number of them chose to go to that opera, thinking, well, it's only me, it's only one, it's only two, we'll go to that opera, this is too great an opportunity. Several chose to go to the opera. That bill was defeated by 4 votes in Parliament that night. Wilberforce was devastated by this defeat, and he walked out of Parliament an utterly dejected man. And he wrote later in his diary that enough at the opera could have carried it. Very much vexed and incensed at our opponents, he said. And I find this just so interesting, because the lure of entertainment, and you see the impact. Sometimes we often think, it doesn't have that much of an impact. You just don't know. I find this such a decision, those people, you think about their minds, great opportunity opens up. There's nothing wrong or sinful about going to see an opera, is there? So I'm sure they went through all of this process, but there's plenty of other people to do the work, to do the voting. It's going to be absolutely fine. And it wasn't. And it was a massive setback, and they lost. William Wilberforce had a nervous breakdown at this point. And he was quite a sickly guy. He was often up and down in his health, but this pushed him to the point. The stress of this ongoing life that he'd had, all this opposition and vilification, he had a nervous breakdown at this time due to the stress, and he almost gave up. And in 1796, he wrote to his mentor, again, John Newton, saying that he was done. He was considering retirement from this sort of public life. And on the 21st of July, 1796, Newton replied in a letter to Wilberforce. We actually have this letter. And he told Wilberforce, firstly, that he had been placed in the Commons to be a witness. He wrote this: "The example and even the presence of a consistent character may have a powerful, though unobserved, effect on others. You are not only a representative for Yorkshire, you have the far greater honour of being a representative for the Lord, in a place where many know him not, and an opportunity of showing them what are the genuine fruits of that religion which you are known to profess." was just such keen insight from Newton there, like reminding him that even though the bill hasn't passed yet, your presence there, the acts that you're doing, standing for Christ and biblical principles in a very hostile environment, that in itself is probably one of the greatest witnesses to many of these politicians that they had ever seen at this time. He then went on, he encouraged him in the trials. He said, "It is true that you live in the midst of difficulties and snares, and you need a double guard of watchfulness and prayer. But since you know both your need of help and where to look for it, I may say to you, as Darius to Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually is able to preserve and deliver you." You can go online and read the whole letter. It's definitely, the whole thing is worth reading. That's just two small sections of it. So the result of this, Newton's wise biblical counsel, he persuaded Wilberforce not to give up. This gave him, these words of encouragement gave him the spur that he needed not to leave Parliament. He wanted to stay there to complete the work that God had given him. And then finally, on March the 25th, 1807, so this is a long time since he first started this battle, after incredible odds, Wilberforce saw the slave trade outlawed. The Abolition of the Slave Trade Act was voted into law. And at this time, the members of the House, after it was read out the results, I think it was a small majority, but it was voted in, the members of the House all rose and saluted William Wilberforce as he sat weeping in his chair, his life's work finally accomplished. So you can probably imagine the emotion that man was going through at that time. Britain became one of the first countries in Europe to abolish the slave trade, and the move thus became a catalyst for actually the adoption of similar legislation around the world. At that time, the English common law was exported across the world, so therefore this was being exported across the world. Secular historian W.H. Leakey, he said this: "The unweary, unostentatious and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the history of nations." What he's basically saying like that is you can scour the history books and you'll never find a group or a nation or a group of people that had this sort of motivation to get rid of one of the evils that has plagued mankind for so long. And again, 2 unassuming evangelicals in a church one evening with prayer and God, and that is it. That's what it took. Obviously, the story is much more involved in that, but the Lord was behind it. However, it wasn't over yet. If you're just saying, you're thinking that's over, no, it wasn't over, because that was just the bill to make to the abolition of slavery. It was another thing to actually have the emancipation, where slaves who were already slaves would be released. And again, Wilberforce was not going to stop until he got that, but that was a great first step. So he was carried on working, and it took him another 26 years to do this. Wilberforce's health by the end of it prevented him from really continuing being the man who was speaking in Parliament. At 62 years old, he handed over the reins to one of his fellow members of the Clapham sect, or the abolitionists at that time. There were a lot of them now at this time. However, he didn't stop. He was still the man working behind the scenes, using all of his personal finance and resources, getting petitions, signing parliaments, distributing pamphlets, doing all the work that he was still supposed to be doing with the same effort he had always done it. And on July 25th, 1833, the bill for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of slavery finally passed the second reading in the House of Commons, bringing slavery to its final end. And this is where everything changed. This is when the British Navy was then conscripted to go after the pirates and the captains and all this sort of stuff, and everything changed at that time. The bill was passed, and 3 days later, he died. So I think, like, the Lord had this man in this world for this one purpose at this one time. From the moment of his conversion, really, until the end of his life, this was his lifelong pursuit, and it was a calling that the Lord gave him. And he died, and you'll see his grave today. That's in Westminster Abbey. You can go and see that there. There's a statue of him. After his death, he became known as the conscience of a nation. And this is an interesting phrase, because you'll see that in history books, but it's never really elaborated upon. And we need to be very clear, make no mistake about it, that Wilberforce, the Clapham sect, all of those people that we name in this crusade against slavery, all of them, pretty much 99% of them, all of the ones we were looking at, the main figures, this was undoubtedly a Christian conscience that was responsible for this. And that is part of the history that's always left out, because that is the motivating factor. that caused them to do this. It was the Christian conscience. Now, you could say there were people, obviously, just with their human conscience that was stirred into action, of course, by the words of these men who were doing it. They needed that. But primarily, this was the evangelical conscience of these men. Wilberforce, after this, and also actually running concurrently with this work, just in case you thought that he was lazy, he had many other campaigns and causes that were, again, the outworking of his Christian faith. He supported better conditions for factory workers. He was the one, again, started the legislation to ban the use of child chimney sweeps. He opposed bull baiting. If you remember, I told you about bull baiting last time. And he is actually the founding member of the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Because, like you remember, the cockfights, the bull baiting, and all the different things they used animals there, he also saw that the Bible teaches a righteous man has regard for the welfare of his animals. So he considered this to be an area that they need to reform too. This group, then, was with the help of the Clapham sect, anything that they saw that needed reform to be in line with biblical standards, this is what they gave their money, time, life, and attention to. They were just dedicated like that. I find it so inspiring to read about these people. He was also the founder of the Bible Society and Religious Tract Society, and the Church Missionary Society. And you read his diaries and his journals, and he was always ministry-minded. There's some very, very sweet entries about how, if he knew he was coming into contact with certain people, he'd look for what he called leaders. And a leader in his context was a way that he could open a conversation with someone and then turn it towards the gospel. Very similar to what you see modern evangelists teaching today, pre-evangelism, or trying to turn the conversation to the spiritual. Again, nothing new. Wilberforce was doing that many, many years ago. And let me just end this. There's so much more you could study on this life, but we're trying to keep it short and concise. One of the most important lives in British history, really, because of the impact that it had. Let me read to you just one final quote from Wilberforce. He says, "May God enable me to have a single eye and a simple heart, desiring to please God, to do good to my fellow creatures, and testify my gratitude to my adorable Redeemer." And that really was the motivation and heart of a man who did everything that he did, simply pleasing his adorable Redeemer with a single eye and a simple heart. Now remember, we studied that recently. A single eye and a simple heart. That means a heart that is wholly devoted, not one that is split and divided between two other things. Not one that's going to go to the opera maybe instead of go and do this important work. It was a single devoted heart. And through that, the Lord changed the world. Amen.
You've been listening to Theology and Apologetics. This podcast is supported by your generous donations. To help us continue to bring you great content, please visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/theologyandapologetics. If you've been blessed by this podcast, please leave us a review and remember to connect with us on social media. For more resources, please go to theologyandapologetics.com. Thanks for listening.